I'm Marianne Wilkinson, the President of the National Council of Women of Canada, and I'd like to welcome you to this uh, workshop that we're doing today online. And it's part of our work on the strategic plan that we've been developing. Is get to go through some of the things that we want to see happening with a series of get together so we get a better understanding of everything. Can you hear okay? I'll get a little closer. I just want to do the land acknowledgement now. We acknowledge the lands in Canada are the home of many Indigenous communities and have held relationship with this land for generations. I thank them for sharing their land and waters with us and recognize the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism and the ill treatment on them over the years. We'll strive to make this acknowledgement a reality, not only in our words, but in our actions to redress the harm done in the past. Today, I actually became aware that the human remains have been found in a landfill in Manitoba, and I'm glad that actions are finally happening to deal with the outstanding matters impacting missing and murdered Indigenous women. So if you hadn't heard that yet, it is a good step forward. I turn over now to Daria, who has actually organized this workshop. Daria?
Thank you so much, Marianne. I think it's important to recognize the work that's being done in the landfill because it was a lot of work to even get to that point here in Manitoba. And it was very controversial when it really just is something that should have been put forward right from the beginning. And I think it's important as advocacy organizations to ensure that we're advocating for all women in Canada and really reflecting what does that mean for our organization? What does it mean for ourselves? And then how do we put that into action so that we don't have to go through all of these battles to get something done that really is a human right for everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today on this really important discussion on resilience and reconciliation, the impact on Indigenous women and families. And we're gathering here in the spirit of learning, reflection, and action, and acknowledgement that reconciliation is an ongoing journey and one that requires an individual, but also a collective commitment, especially with our organizations. The session is going to be an opportunity for us to explore the intersection of reconciliation and resilience, particularly through the lens of Indigenous women and families, as throughout history and contemporary society, Indigenous women have been at the heart of their communities, leading, healing, and advocating for change despite facing deep-rooted systemic barriers. Together, we'll reflect on how we contribute to reconciliation efforts that are meaningful, sustainable, and rooted in justice. Our speaker, Denyse Nadon, will guide us through this conversation, really sharing her insights and knowledge as we explore what reconciliation means in practical terms, having a bit of that discussion on how we can collectively support Indigenous women and families. And as we step into this space, to let us listen with open hearts and engage with respect and commitment to action that uplift First Nations, Métis, and Inuit voices. I'm very proud to introduce now Denyse Nadon, who's a proud Algonquin woman from the Apitipi Anishinaabe
Anishinaabe.
Nation.
That's
She's
good.
from the Bear Clan, from Bear Clan, and she is known as Kokokoo Ik8e, Screech Owl Woman,
Mhm.
and is a dynamic entrepreneur, cultural educator, and leader with 25 years of experience as an Indigenous adult educator and trainer. And Denyse is the founder and CEO of Tribulaire Cosmetics and Skincare and Bear Vision Consulting and Training, both dedicated to empowering Indigenous communities through cultural authenticity, education, and mentorship. So welcome, Denyse. So happy to have you have this conversation with you and this discussion. Really looking forwards to our lunch hour presentation.
Yes, well, wonderful. Thanks for having me. Kokokoo Ik8e. So if you look at the word, it looks there's a number 8 in my name. And a lot of people say to me, I think there's a spelling mistake in your name. But the 8 represents a W in our language. So it's Kokokoo Ik8e, IK8E. So Ikwe means woman in Algonquin or the Abitibi dialect. So thank you so much for having me. I've been doing a lot of thinking and reflecting about our discussion and our time here. And I'm always so grateful that organizations such as yourselves really want to come together because we think about the Truth and Reconciliation document that initially started in 1996 with the Royal Proclamation of Aboriginal people at that time. So it was the initial discussion phases. But that document never really went anywhere. It was sort of like a guide, and people didn't know what to do with it nationally. And so then it wasn't till 2008 where we actually started the TRC, where the discussions came out. And it actually it launched because of the residential schools is really where this document came out because the other reports that were out there didn't really pinpoint what or why we should be doing this work together. So it was the residential school survivors that actually brought us to this point, which leads me to who I really am. Like Darius said, I am an Algonquin from the Abitibi Nation, but most importantly, I am a daughter of a residential school survivor. My mom's name is Shirley Black. Her married name is Nadon, and we're from Abitibi, which is outside of Matheson, Northern Ontario. And there's two small communities one is called Lowbush, and the other one is called Eads, and they're 5 miles apart by train. My mom is from Lowbush, and my dad is from Eads. So they're from the same lake, just different locations. And what had happened back then, the train came from Cochrane, and it pulled up to Lowbush. And the Indian agent at that time came in and actually used one of my cousins, one of my late cousins, Sonny. Um, the guy came off the train and he had a bunch of candies. And he said to my cousin Sonny, "Go get all the kids. I have all these candies for you." And of course, little Indian kids, like the train was always an exciting time for them because it was new people and so. But this was a different day. The bag of candies showed up. So my cousin gathered all of the kids, and one of those kids was my mother and all her siblings. And so all the little Indian kids jumped into the train, and then they ended up closing the door. And so that's how that happened. And then while they were eating their candies, the train started leaving and it stopped 5 miles up where my dad's family was. But at that time, Abitibi Forestry was there. They were actually doing the log boom on Abitibi Lake. And my grandfather, Joe Nadon, had 14 kids there. And my father was one of them. He was the oldest boy. But they were using these little kids as workers, right? So when you do log booming, all the logs are in the lake and they're bunched up. And so my father and his siblings were the log runners. So they would jump on the lake and, make sure that the logs weren't jamming up. And I mean, it's probably the most dangerous job, but when you're little kids, right, it was kind of fun for them. So when the Indian agent came to pick up my dad and his siblings, it just happened to be that day. Now, I don't know if this is luck. It all depends on if you speak to my dad or you speak to my mom. It just happened to be the big boss of Abitibi was at Eads that day. And when the Indian agent came, he said to my grandfather, "I need your kids. We're taking your kids." And the Abitibi boss said, "You can't take those kids. We need them. They're our workers." My aunties were actually housekeepers. They were cooks. It was a man's camp, right? So that's why my father didn't end up going. So the train went on. And my mom went to residential school in Amos, Quebec, and they were there for about 10 years. And I remember, speaking to my father and my parents over the years, and something that my dad said to me I found really heartbreaking. He said, "I remember that time when all the kids were on the train and they all were gone, they took off." And he said that was the first time that he actually heard silence. He said, in our day, all you heard was kids laughing and playing and having fun. And then after that, it was sheer silence. And he said it was really strange. You could hear a bird or two, but really not what they were used to. And then he said what he started hearing after that was fighting, drinking and fighting and disruption. And that was the parents, right? And so I really listened to my parents when they talked about that. And I think that's a good place to start this discussion because when we think about truth and reconciliation, we think about these documents, we think about this little booklet, the TRC, not the calls to action. And as an Indigenous adult educator, I have my degree, I have my master's in education. I'm working on my doctorate in it as well. And a lot of times we think the written word is the key to it, and it doesn't capture everything that actually has happened. So that's my mom and dad's real story. So my mom is educated. She's got a grade 10 as a result of residential school, but it taught her how to clean and cook, really, is what they taught her. But my dad has zero education. Like I think he spent half a day in a day school at the time, and it was just he didn't know how to read or write. So the Nadon side is illiterate, but the black side is educated. And so when you come from those two worlds, it's a little bit complicated growing up, right? I have a father who pushed us to go as far as we possibly can because he wanted us to fit in and he understood the value of education because he didn't have any. And then on the other hand, I had a mother who wanted us to get educated but was so afraid for us. So we were constantly in the battle of those two worlds. But it brings me, I want to share a story about my grandmother, Mary Black, who lost all her kids. And when I was 15, I remember getting a call I remember going to a high school dance and coming home, and I saw my mom and dad standing at the top of the stairs. I was 15 years old, and I could tell, when something's wrong, you see that look, and I was like, just tell me. And she said, your grandma died this evening. And I remember literally falling because my grandmother and I were like this. It was two peas in the pod, and so it took a lot out of me when she left us. I remember my grandmother overdosed on heat. This would be Adderall. That's not the speed. Well, I think it's called Adderall and alcohol. And I remember saying, no, she did. No, she wouldn't do that. So years go by. Well, we go to the funeral, and I'm still sitting there not believing what they're telling me. And so they showed me the autopsy report to prove to me. I still didn't believe it. So as years go on, I fall into the addictions like probably most of us did, put myself in some compromising places, which is why I'm really grateful to be alive today, to be able to share my story with people. But I remember over the years trying to figure out what is going on in this world. So my very first job was with the Matau First Nations in Thunder Bay, and it's a group of communities, 10 First Nation communities. And it was my first job, and they said, Denise, you can go filing. So they put me in a little wee room with all of these papers. And I remember starting to create their filing system. And of course, when you're filing, you got to read things, right? So I was reading this document and it was on residential schools. And I was like, what? I remember my brain not being able to understand what I was reading. Like I could not understand that the government took children and put them in these schools. And it was just mind blowing. So that night I ended up calling my mom and dad. I'm very close to my parents. So anything I ever did, I always told them. And I said to them, oh my God, mom and dad, you wouldn't believe. Did you know there was residential schools? Did you know that they taken the kids and blah, blah, blah? And and they were quiet on the other end. And I was 19 at that time, and they were very quiet. And I was like, what's going on? And my mom said, we didn't want to tell you, or we didn't know how to tell you, but I went to one of those schools. And I was like, what? Like, imagine being 19 years old, and I have two brothers and two sisters, and we have no idea, no clue. All we know is that my dad worked every day. My mom made sure we had 3 square meals a day. Our hair had to be done properly. We never missed school. It was just very rigid upbringing. So, needless to say, my mind was blown away, which led me to become more curious. So I did more research and I started really paying attention to our indigenous leadership at that time. I was wondering, why are we, first of all, why do we have a group of nations, the Matao First Nations, and why are things this way? So that was the kind of opening for me, the door opened for me to really realize that I was actually an Indian, because at that time that's what they called us. We were Indians, right? But I didn't know what kind of Indian I was, which was even more strange, right? Anyway, so I found out that I was Algonquin. And so that again opened another door of curiosity. I started figuring out who that was. But as I went along, I had to piece, I had to come to terms with my own healing. It was one of the elders at the time. I was in a very rough relationship, um, almost to a point where this man tried to kill me. So to be honest, I can't even believe I'm still here. There was a bigger force at play here. I'm meant to be here for something bigger than myself, because he was choking me and I should have died. My eyes closed and I remember seeing a light, and I thought, that's it. That's how I'm going down. But it, I don't know what happened. I opened the door and I managed to get away. And so when after that episode happened, I went to speak to an elder in Thunder Bay, and I told him what was happening to me. And that's when he said, Denise, you need to start healing. And I was 19 years old, and I'm like, what is healing? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I thought everything was fine. I thought I'm living like everybody else. But then he introduced me to the indigenous way of healing and learning and talking about creator and our ancestors. And it was really, again, another curiosity, right? So I started going down that path, listening to the drum, going to the powwows, and they were all kind of new in, the early 90s for us in Thunder Bay, especially. So when that started happening to me, my learning spirit or healing spirit started to open. And it brought me to my grandmother again. And that question that I had is, she didn't die like that. She didn't die from drinking and drugging. There had to be more to it. So I started piecing together my story, listening more to my mom and my aunties, and piecing it all together. And I realized it when I was younger, every summer, because we had moved away from Cochrane, we moved towards Nikina for work purposes. My dad had to raise his children, and I was 7 years old when we left our traditional territory. And my parents said not too long ago that they took us away because of the violence, the drinking, and all the stuff that was going on. And he wanted his children to have a chance at life. So they took us away from our own families. But when that was happening, my mom and dad would send me back with my grandmother every summer, and we'd go on the land. I'd get in a canoe with her, and she'd show me all these places and drop all these little hints of knowledge. When you're 7, 8, 9, 10, you don't really know what she's talking about. You're there, you want to be outside, you want to pick blueberries, you want to go swimming, right? But she would always sit me down and share things with me. But I could never understand really what she was talking about until I was in my mid-30s. But she would bring me every summer. My parents would drop me off in Cochrane, My grandmother would come off the train again from Lowbush, the same place where they took her kids, and we'd go to the grocery store and she would buy all her supplies for the month because we'd be going on the land for the entire month. After she would go shopping and we'd be all set, we would rent a room at the King George in Cochrane. And then she would proceed to go to the bar. And being in small town of Cochrane, a couple thousand people at that time, everybody knew her. She was vibrant, she was friendly, she loved talking to people but she would sit in the bar all night and I would sit outside and I could hear them say, "Hey, Mary Black," and I would hear her dancing and everybody laughing and other people would come out and give me a quarter to go buy junk food. I mean, back in the day you could sit outside because I was, Mary Black's granddaughter. So I was pretty safe in that area. But at the end of the night, I would have to literally carry my grandmother back to the hotel room. And she would be crying all the time. And I remember sitting there as a young girl going, "What is she crying for?" Like, I just listened to her partying around, laughing and dancing. And now she's sitting here crying. And so I couldn't make sense as a young kid what this all meant. And plus, my parents didn't drink, so I didn't grow up in any alcohol. So it was just, again, a little confusing, but the love was always there for my grandmother. No matter what she did, it didn't matter, right? But I remember piecing together my own healing journey. And this every summer when I would go there, and every night after the bar, and it would only be one night. She'd only party once, then we get on a train and go. But she would run a bath for me in this much water, like literally this much water. And I remember, when I'm 7 years old and eight, nine, right up until I was 14, she would have this little bath. And then, when you're getting a little bit older, your little boobies are coming out and you're kind of getting shy, right? And then you get cold because there's not enough water, right? But she would bathe me and she'd be all drunk. And I would be like, "Okay, well, that's what grandma does, right?" And put me in my new pajamas and boom, go to bed. And then off to the bush we would go. And that'd be it. My life would go on and all the stories would happen. But in my early 30s, that's when I started piecing together all of this information I had. And I had to do it again for my own survival as a young Indigenous woman in these spaces. And what I realized, again, and it comes back to why she died, what I realized at that time, I said, "Oh my God, my grandmother didn't die from alcohol and drugs. She literally died from a broken heart." If you really think about it, they took all her children. All her life purpose was gone, right? She was a beautiful mother and and all of that was taken. So that gave me some, I don't know, I guess some hope or some settlement in my own being that, you know what? Okay, she didn't do this on purpose. This is why it happened. And when I started really sharing that story with my entire family, because it was still kind of hush hush on the residential school stuff, right? We weren't quite ready to deal with it, and we didn't know really what the impacts were. So it was a little bit of navigating through people's emotions and traumas, I guess, within the nation and within the family. So once I figured that out, then my healing really opened up. And then I started taking a real interest in this residential school stuff. Like, what is this? And then it came to, again, my realizations always come to me because I'm always reflecting and praying and thinking about things. And I was like, "Oh my God, we are a nation of people." If you think about residential schools, right? They took the young people, right? And if you follow the medicine wheel, if you know anything about the medicine wheel, the eastern doorway is where the sun rises every day. It's a new beginning, and that's where we place our children, the babies. But in the southern door is the young people. So that's where you're starting to grow and figure things out. And then in the western doorway that's the adulthood. And then in northern doorway, that's our elder space. So as human beings, we all go through that cycle or that circle of life. And so when I started thinking about our nation, all the people that have went through residential schools, the 60s scoop, all of these things, right? I started to piece it all together and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, the system, the genocidal system, and that's what a lot of people don't like to hear the word genocide, but that's really what it was. That was the intention behind it. And the one way of doing it that they tried was residential school, was they took all the young people. But then now you hear about the 60s scoop, right? That's starting to make its way. It's becoming really vocal, but they took the babies. So again, if you think about that medicine wheel, they took the babies, they took the young people, and then you look at the adults. What did they do with the adults at that time? And it was our leadership, right? The way I see it, the leadership that they took away our lands. There was no more there was no governance, the leaders there could no longer, they had no children, they had no babies. So they were left with nothing. So that's where the alcohol and the violence all started to come. And then you look at the north part where the elders sit. What they took away from there was, sorry, sorry, there's somebody talking. What they took away from us in the north, the elders, was the ceremonies. So when you look at that entire picture, it was meant to eliminate us. And as a nation with these beautiful spaces that we come from, it took a toll on us. So, and I tell people all the time, if you look at, pretend you're shopping, you're going down a little road and you see a shop. And a lot of times what we do is we just window shop. We look what's there, right? Oh, there's a nice outfit there, or there's this here, just in the window. And a lot of what's happened in Canada is there's a lot of window shopping. We only see there. We've never once went in the store or the community, so to speak, right? So what we see on the streets are homelessness, alcohol, violence, like we see those things, right? And then our natural minds or way is like, oh my God, all these Indians are drunks. They're violent. They're this and they're that. So there's that stereotype, right? But nobody actually went into the store to go and see what really went on, what's really happening. And so that's where, to me, that's how I translate the truth and reconciliation. It started with the truth. And the truth was my mother went, my uncles went. They were sexually abused, physically abused, you name it, it happened, right? And so they had an opportunity to share their truth, which was the first step. And so that report came out, but the second part was the reconciliation part. And what I've come to learn these days is that reconciliation is not just your responsibility, which I thought it was. I thought in my mind back in the day, okay, well, we told the truth. My mom told the truth. It's all good. So now they need to reconcile. But as I live more and I get involved more in TRC and I spend time in my nation, I spend time with other organizations, other nations, other people. I started to realize that reconciliation actually starts with me. It started with me, the Algonquin woman from Abitibi. I had to not only listen to the truth with my mother, but I had to reconcile that truth. And it was a very painful truth because I was actually there when we went to Toronto where she went and did her testimony of what actually happened to her. And like I said, my mom and dad didn't drink, right? But that day she went in to do her in front of the lawyer to talk about what actually happened to her. Her and my uncle went in and shared their truth. And I asked my mom, I said, and my uncle, I said, what is it that you need from me when you come out? Anything you need, Just let me know and I will get you whatever you need. And my mom said, I want a drink when I'm done. And I was like, okay. So I went to the liquor store. I don't even know what my mom drank. I didn't know any of that. So I'm like, I just grabbed some wine. I'm like, here, there, I'll just leave it there. And my dad was there. And of course, my dad, again, not going to school and not really, like, he never really, not that he didn't care about what happened to my mom. He just wanted to put it behind him. He didn't want to face it either, right? So my dad was a little worried that, oh my God, we haven't drank in 30 years. Oh my God, we're gonna give mom, what's gonna happen to mom? And I said, you know what, Dad, let her have this. Like, you don't know her experience. You might live with her, you might have 5 kids with her, but I'm sure there's things that she hasn't told you, that you don't really want to, it's not something you really want to talk about. So, sure enough, they both came out, my uncle and my mom, and they're like, pour us a drink. And I'm like, okay. So they had their drink and their cigarette. We didn't talk about it. I just asked them, where would you guys like to go eat? And my uncle said, and my mom said, we want to go to the spaghetti factory in Niagara Falls. So we brought them there. And we had a nice meal and we'd never talked about it. But what happened? Remember when Harper did his apology? I think that was 2008. I remember standing there with my younger sister, and we were at the Friendship Center in Yellowknife because I was working up in the Northwest Territories. And on the big TV screen was Stephen Harper, and he did his apology. And I had this brief moment where I saw this spider, a mama spider. And spiders carry their babies on the back, right? And I saw this mama spider, and when the apology came out, this vision in my mind was all of these baby spiders fell onto the floor and they all started scattering, like scattering everywhere, bumping into each other, getting run over because we were on the street, right? And getting stepped on. And I was like, so over the years doing my healing and doing the work that I have to do, I thought, oh my God, that's my understanding of what the TRC is going to do to us. Some of us are going to make it and some of us are not. And again, when you open a can of worms like that, things happen. And to me, that's what happened. Some of us made it and some of us didn't. A lot of there's a lot of my family members that are gone. They overdosed or they drank themselves to death or, especially when some of the money was given out, they were given a compensation and again, of course, I come from my dad too, and my dad's again not didn't really grow up in the indigenous way of being. So he, in his mind, he was very logical. He's like, if you give them money, they're all gonna die, right? And that's my dad's mentality at that time. And for me, I was like, yeah, you're right, Dad, but who are we? Like, I don't know about, based on what I've heard and I've listened to some of the stories, I am surprised that a lot of our people did survive. And so when my mom ended up getting her money, she ended up investing it again because she was with my dad. So they really built the life for themselves, which was really wonderful. But when she received that cash, she also received her indigenous name, her Indian name, and her name is Good Standing Woman. And to me, that is the most beautiful name that anybody could have because I think about it, knowing what I know about my mom and her story. She doesn't have to be kind. She doesn't have to be good, knowing what I know, right? But yet she is the most beautiful, loving, and good woman that I've ever met. And so I look to her every time things go messed up in my mind or when I see situations happening, I really think about her and I'm like, okay, Denyse, you have a responsibility. You cannot go over the edge here. And it's out of sheer respect for my mother and my grandmother because those two women have to survive in order for me to be here today, to actually be standing here. So, I had to really shift how I lived my life because I was like, I'm doing no justice. It would be a crime if I was to go off and, do not live a good life. So that's sort of how I've come to be. This is why I do what I do, is I want the reconciliation part to be told by truth from me. And that way, when it comes, when you ladies are trying to figure out how to work with it, at least you'll hear somebody's truth, because we all have different ones, right? I don't know if you guys have been around or have noticed, and feel free to jump in and ask any questions, by the way. It's okay. I don't mind some clarification if you need it. So I look at truth and reconciliation today and what's happening. And you've probably heard the term pretendians. That's really big on the radar right now in Canada. And a lot of it it's troubling for some of us that have come through this process, right? We're kind of like, oh my God, who are these people talking about us? What are they saying? And so I'm starting to piece that together as well. Is that because of the TRC, because of all of the things that are happening, surfacing, the 60 scoop, a lot of our people are coming back. Their identities are being found, like they're finding themselves, and that's a great thing. But there's some people that are really not, and that's a whole nother issue. But one of the challenges that we're having now is that we have two truths, so to speak. One is coming from people like me, like my mother, who's actually lived it. And then the other ones are the ones who are reading it and Googling it, or just finding their way and going into these spaces and talking from this perspective. And there's nothing wrong with this perspective, but I think if we really want to get into decolonization and truth and reconciliation, it needs to come from stories like this, because that's the realness, right? Because, and again, as an educator, and it gets a bit tricky because some people say, yeah, but Denyse, you have your master's, like you're educated in the Western system. I'm like, yeah, I am in one way, but in the other way, I'm also bringing the indigenous knowledge to those institutions, right? Because the biggest part for TRC is education. And late Murray Sinclair said, education got us into this. Education's going to get us out of it. Now, what did he really mean by that, right? It doesn't mean that all Indigenous people now go back to the Western education and go to the original vision of education. And the original vision of education, residential schools, was to kill the Indian, right? To 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 genocide, to colonize us. That was the original intent. They didn't see us as humans. So they wanted to go in and change our worldview, and they almost did. There are some people in this world, people that I speak to, that I hang with, and they're colonized. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. When I say colonization, it's a way, it's your way of being. Just like I have an indigenous way of being, there's a white way of being, there's a black way of being, and there's an Asian way of being. And again, I always bring it back to the medicine wheel, right? The four races of man: indigenous, Asian, black, and white. Those are the four races of man. And each race has a gift. And so again, when you go back to that medicine wheel, that's what I wish, having these talks, I wish we could be face to face, because then I could draw it and explain it. But if you look in the Eastern doorway, that's the gift. There is the gift of spirit. And that's the indigenous, our way. That's what we hold. In the Southern doorway, that's the Asian worldview. Chinese, that race of people, they have the gift of emotion. In the Western doorway is the Black race, and they have the gift of physical. And in the northern doorway, that's the white race, and they have the gift of intelligence. So you have emotional, spiritual, emotional, physical, and mental or intellect. And based on my research, my ceremonies, my understanding of the world is that we have the white race, the northern direction has been dominating everything coming from this place. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not balanced. We thinking is great. We need it, but we also need spirit. We also need emotions. We also need our physical. So there's that balance, right? And the more that we talk about TRC, the more I do, the more I bring in that medicine wheel because I think if we want to come together, and I know we do because we wouldn't be sitting here together, we need to know what gift we have. And we need to know when to use it and when not to use it. And right now, the world, we were talking, I heard, talking about Trump, he's on our radar too as Indigenous people. We're like the 51st state. Has he talked to the Indians yet? The Indigenous people? He hasn't. And that, so to us, it's kind of a joke, but it's a serious joke, right? So we're going to be very aware of what we're watching, what he does. But again, if you think about that wheel, we need all of each other and we need to be able to use those special gifts in a balanced way. And right now, the way I see the world, we're in that spiritual and an emotional state. I don't know if you ladies know, you see what's going on, the mental health challenges, the domestic violence, the homelessness, like all of the challenges, and they're just not Indigenous challenges. They're everywhere. Now, when I go window shopping, I just don't see brown people. I see all people. There's people on the streets in Ottawa that are from all different races. There's people in downtown Timmins and Thunder Bay. They're not just brown, predominantly brown anymore. They're everybody. And so for me, when I see that, I'm like, okay, good. And I mean that in a different kind of a way. I say good because I think it has to force all of us to look at each other and say, okay, how do we do this together? How do we save the people? Right? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. How do we save the women and the children? Like those are really crucial pieces for the human race. I remember I was in I'm a little bit political, but not really. People will get me to come and talk and I'll tell them the truth in a kind of a really nice way, in a storytelling way. So I'm part of Treaty 9, Anishinaabe Nation, and there's 49 First Nations in our group. And I can't remember what year it was. I want to say early 2000s. They wanted to start a women's council. Finally, right? They had the chiefs there and they were all men. They had a youth council and they had no women's council. And I was like, so they finally, and they had to separate. They wanted a Western Thunder Bay, Northwestern Ontario, and a Northeastern Timmins women's group because that's how big the area is, right? So our issues in the East were a little bit different than the women in the West. So, anyways, they called me. They said, we don't know any women in the East, so why don't you come, Denise, to the first meeting in Sulikout? I said, okay. So I flew to Sulikout. I'm the only one from the East, and there's 10 Indigenous women from the West. And they're sitting there and they're sitting across the table from me, almost like a negotiations. And I'm like, what are we negotiating for? I thought we were here to build a women's council to address our issues. Anyways, our deputy chief, late Goyce Gakagamek, was there, and he was responsible at that time for the women's development of the women's council. And I was looking at him, and he's like, okay, ladies, it's up to you what you want to do, but here you go. And he throws down a check for $10,000. And I was like, I look at the check, and right away, the ladies from the West, they grab it and they're like, I think we need it more and this and that. And they were really going, they really wanted the $10,000. And I was like, I looked at Goyce and I looked at the women. I said, I'm not fighting over this, you guys. You can have it. I said, $10,000 might give each woman today in our nation, a penny each. I'm not fighting over a penny. So I gave them a 10,000. I said, you can have it, but we need to have a further discussion about this women's council. So I left it at that. I went back to my area. And then I was invited to the Chiefs meeting that following July in Brunswick House, which is northeastern Ontario. And this is where they introduced the Women's Council. And again, I brought some women from the East. A lot of the women from the West came and they called us up. And I told the women from in my area, I said, you're going to come and stand up with me because they're going to introduce us. Or they were just going to introduce me and the one lead from the West. And I said, no, I'm not going to stand here by myself. So I brought the women up and Goyce was there, late Goyce was there, and he looked at me, he's like, what are you doing? I disrupted their meeting, I guess, right? All these men. And I said, this is how we do things. So I sit down and he slides over a piece of paper. He's sitting beside me, he slides it over to me, and I open it up, respectfully, because all the chiefs are there, and it's my speech. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that you spoke for me. Like, like what's going on here? So I was like, he just looks at me and I give him a nod and then I get up and I stand up and I introduce myself and I proceed to rip up the paper. So when I say I'm a little political, that's what I'm talking about. My little younger days, a little rebel sometimes, right? So I rip up the paper and I said, nobody speaks for us. Sorry, Goyce, thank you for your kind gesture, but I'm not reading this. You're going to hear from us. You're going to hear from me. So I proceeded to introduce all the women. And then I introduced myself last. And then I gently reminded them. I said to them in these exact words, I said, if it wasn't for women, you guys wouldn't be here. And so if you want to start a women's council, that's where we need to come from. And there was dead silence. I thought, there goes my career. There goes anything that I ever thought I was going to, because I was already involved at that level, traveling with the chiefs and getting involved in all that. One elder I'll always remember Alfred. I saw him kitty corner of me way in the back. He had long hair. He was the traditional guy. And we didn't have very many back then. And he stood up and he did the little clap, that clap. And I was like, okay, at least out of 49, one is good, I'm saved, I thought. And then eventually everybody stood up. And so we have a women's council today, which is a lot more than what we had at the time. But I will say I was never called back. But that's okay, right? Sometimes you just, as women, life givers, matriarchs, educators, teachers, maybe that's all my job is to just plant that seed, just plant it, open that door maybe, and then let the others kind of do what they have to do. So that's sort of how that's been my kind of my life, right? If I get these opportunities, I'll tell you what I think in a good way because as Algonquins, there's two things you need to know about us. One is we're kind, and two, we have common sense. So you bring those together, it's not that complicated, right? We can give and take, but we can also be open. We have a worldview that is open and understanding of how we need to do this. We don't want to live alone, you know? A lot of people have talked to me about the TRC and, I'll be in a doctor's office or a dentist office and I'll have the conversation with people that are sitting there and they're like, do you want us to leave? I'm like, what do you mean? Where are you going to go? You're actually, you have your great grandchildren are here. It's not that we want you to leave. When you think about TRC, especially and all the other things, it's all about the land at the end of the day. Even with Trump, you think about what that guy wants, that he's delusional. That guy, for some reason, thinks that he can just walk in here and do what? And now we know what he wants. He wants the land. He wants the resources, right? Canada is wealthy with resources, so that's what he wants. But that's also what everybody's kind of battling about within Canada too, is the land. You have the land defenders, the women's groups, the water defenders, right? You have these groups of Indigenous people, and if you don't know anything about TRC or about the real history of Canada, then we look like shit disturbers. But we're really not. We're actually, and if you think about who we are as Indigenous people, we have a sacred responsibility to the land. I won't say we own the land because it's not for, it's nobody owns it, but we are the guardians and we are responsible for it. And we hold that responsibility so closely to us. And again, when we think about when you have that way of thinking and knowing, it's about 15 generations. And when I say 15 generations, I think of the 7 generations behind me, the ancestors, the ones that came before me. And I think about them in my current state right now at 54 years old in this time. Then I got to think about the next 7. So when we think about decision making and responsibility as Indigenous people, that it takes us a while sometimes to make a decision. And again, all the different worldviews and experiences and all of that stuff plays a big part, right? And so if we don't understand those things, the bigger picture, then people tend to think a little bit different about us, right? But until you understand that worldview, it's complicated. And I know we want to talk a little bit about terminology. Back in the day, we were called Indians. The Indian Act, right? It's still in there. I always say, my grandmother always said, you're an Indian no matter what, unless they're calling you something like a dirty Indian, then we got a problem, right? But until then, there's no problem. But then it got into, the government came in and started thinking about different things. Oh my God, we got human rights and all these other things. So they started calling us Aboriginal. Do you remember that term? We couldn't even spell it. We were like, how do you spell that? So we got into that. Then that changed again for whatever reason. It went into First Nations. And that was something that I could identify more. I could identify really with being called an Indian because of my connection to my grandmother. That's all we knew. So, and then when it got into First Nations, I was like, ooh, that actually helped me a bit more to really open my eyes to the other nations that are around us. And then got me into understanding that I'm Algonquin. I mean, I was raised with Ojibways. I thought I was Ojibwe. No idea there was Algonquins, right? Until the First Nations started coming up. And so that's how the nations in my mind, that's where I started opening up to different nations. And then so it went from First Nations and now it's Indigenous. And a lot of us have a problem with Indigenous. And the problem we have with Indigenous is it puts us on in one umbrella with the Métis, the Inuit, and the First Nations. And we love our brothers and sisters, the Métis Nation, and we love the Inuit. There's not a problem there between us. We have a lot of commonalities. But as a nation, I'm from the Abitibi Anishinaabe Nation. You notice I didn't say First Nation. And the reason why we don't say First Nation is because we are a nation within ourselves. So almost like if you think about the federal government and Abitibi Anishinaabe Nation, they are equal. You look at the 633 nations in Canada, they are actual nations. So technically, I would say there's 635 nations and Canada's included in that. I just added one. It's called Canada. So a government to government, right? So when we're learning about different nations, I always, go find out who they are. They'll tell you, we have 10 Algonquin nations within our umbrella, and they're all on the Quebec side, Barrier Lake, all different ones, and they have different dialects. And then you have the Dene people, and then the Haudenosaunee, right? And then within those, are the nations, right? So where I come from, it's called the Algonquian. So it's sort of the umbrella. And in there you have the Cree, the Dene, the Algonquins, and Blackfoot. So you have all these other tribes underneath the Algonquian umbrella. Just like the Haudenosaunee, they're like an umbrella, but they have the Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohawk. So that's how the system works within our nations. And honestly, we're all starting to learn that. I'm noticing the young people are starting to figure it out because of the truth and reconciliation and all the healing that our nations have been doing. They're bringing that knowledge back to us, the young
Denise,
people.
so
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass this off to Stephanie to lead the facilitation for some of those questions.
Okay.
Um,
Perfect.
I I really appreciate your experience and your sharing with us today. I think it's really framed a lot of discussion, and there's been some questions in the chat. So I wanted to make sure that we could frame some of that discussion. And I know we only have a couple minutes left because we were supposed to end at 1, but I think some people probably would like to stay on. But I'll leave that to Stephanie to facilitate, just because I have to head off. But I just wanted to say, very appreciative of this beginning of this discussion. I think that this is a good start and foundation for our organization to continue that discussion and really take more opportunities to hear from you and people across Canada. So thank you so
Thank you.
much. And please, if anyone has any questions, if you could raise your hand in the little react thing, and Stephanie will be able to answer your questions, or maybe even speak to some of the ones that were in the chat. And then also Denise also provides you with some time as well. So thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.
I'll leave this to you, Stephanie. Thank you so much, Denise.
Thank you, Daria. It was so nice to see you.
Thank
Very
you
nice.
so much, Daria. And we do have a comment from Bonnie Siemens. Your stories about the children being lured with candy on the trains is absolutely gut-wrenching. She says that it sits very heavy with her, and she thanks you for sharing all of your memories and your references to the circle of life, and it's very poignant. So thank you very much, Bonnie, for that comment. We do have a comment and a question from our member Shaheen. She writes, where do people like me, brown people, fit in? I know you were describing earlier about the doors in the northern hemisphere and the southern one, and she wanted to know where she might find herself fitting in that door.
Yeah, that's interesting. To us, it goes in the eastern doorway. We go into those spaces, or it could be the black doorway as well, too, right? And one of the ways that I found out that I'm learning more about where the races of women fit, I'll use women, is I went to West Africa a couple of weeks ago in January, sorry, for 2 weeks. And my friend, his ancestors are from West Africa. And Trudy's been my soul sister, and she's been around me and all our ceremonies, Sundance, for the last 15 years. And what happened to her during this 15 years together is that she realized that how we were healing as Indigenous people in this country, that she had to do the same. So we ended up going to West Africa and meeting her people there a few weeks ago. But so again, it's fitting in is where I think you could come and hang with us and figure out that as you go, right? Because that's what happened to my sister Trudy. She was with us, and it really opened her up and inspired her and brought her back to her traditional homelands of West Africa, even though she's a third generation Canadian. It really, inspired her. So it's a learning journey, right? And I think part of my master's, when I started writing, I often write about opening that learning spirit. And I think not just for Indigenous people or Algonquins or Mohawks, all of us, right? Opening that learning spirit and just having the conversation and finding somebody that you trust, that you can just ask those questions. I mean, that's you guys are in a great place as an organization
Yeah,
to be able to
if I may
support
say
that.
something.
Absolutely.
So in the holy book, the Quran, it says that, and we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes so that you know one another, not that you hate one another. So I always keep that in my focus, that I have to know everyone, because God created us all. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
And I
very
think that's where the healing comes from, right? We're starting to now open up to different cultures, different ways of healing, different, it's not it's different on how we do it, but it's the same, right? We're a human family at the end of the day, but we all have these beautiful natural gifts that I believe should be allowed to be shared. And when you need the spiritual component, then go see the brown people, right?
Thank you very much, Shaheen and Denise. We do have our member Linda McDonald from the East Coast. She has her hand up for a question for you, Denise. Go ahead.
Hi, Denise. Jean Sarson is a member as well. We went to Thunder Bay and stayed with a woman in Thunder Bay. I wonder if you knew her. Her name was Lynn Moss Sharman. She's not alive anymore, but she worked very closely with the Indigenous women in Thunder Bay, and I wondered if she was there at the same time as you were there.
I remember that like the last name is familiar, but
Sharman, yeah, you didn't
yeah,
know. Yeah,
yeah.
she was very caring, and she went up north to work with the Indigenous women. I was just curious.
Mhm.
Thank you
And,
for
and I like that when we ask these questions because you'd be surprised how much the indigenous world is really quite small. We all know each other, I'll give you
Yeah,
an example. Yesterday I'm actually on my way to my nation. My auntie is the Chief June Black, and she's actually in the hospital with pneumonia in ICU, right? And she's one of our great, just powerful indigenous women. Anyway, so I was in Montreal yesterday for the International Indigenous Tourism Conference, and as I was walking out, the National Chief Cindy Woodhouse was there. And I walked up to her and I said, "Hi, and how are you?" I introduced myself and told her where I was from. And I knew that she knew my auntie because we've just finished our first Indigenous or Algonquin law in our nation. And when we presented it, the national chief came in and did a little presentation and really loves my auntie Junie. So anyway, she gifted my auntie a beautiful eagle feather that I have to deliver to her in the hospital. But
nice.
again, that's how small we really are.
Mm,
We all know each other, we support each other, and I'm hoping that we continue to do this work together because the life
support.
givers, all of us.
Yeah. Well, I hope the best for your auntie too, that she heals.
Yeah, the prayers are coming in quite strongly, so if I can ask for that from each of you women, that would be wonderful too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Next, we have Jeanne Sarson. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your story. One of the issues that I find is always interesting is that for some reason, even though we're only one species on this planet, we keep dividing ourselves into groups here and there. And what it really came home for me, I had my DNA done out of curiosity. And they tell me that collectively my roots are in the Congo and South Africa, in Central Africa, and ended up 26% Aboriginal and 26% Scottish. So as one race, we keep mixing all around the world, and yet we have difficulty joining together collectively for peace and wellness and support. So I'm just interested to ask because I worked in the Arctic for 11 years and spent a lot of time with the elders. And I heard a lot of their stories, even in the Arctic with warfare, tribal warfare. And I'm just wondering how the Native communities in Canada resolve the fact that there was warfare always. We keep fighting with each other. How do we get beyond our fighting and our differentiation when we really should be all one? So
Yeah.
it's just a question and
I
a
love it.
deep
It's
one.
always
Yeah.
it's always on my mind. And where did you work in the NWT or the Arctic?
Yeah, I worked across the Arctic. I got married in Inuvik and worked in Fort Norman and worked in the Keewatin and worked in Baffin Island.
Nice.
So, and the Yukon eventually. So,
I built a learning center in Inuvik in 2018.
oh, did you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I'm going back up to the NWT there in the next couple of months to help them rebuild their Dene cultural center that
Yeah,
burnt down.
yeah.
I'm going to help them do some of the organizational development stuff there. But I do want to talk about your question or the thoughts that you have about, trying to get along. I think about life as an onion, right? You were always peeling back the layers until you get to that core, that light. And I think based on history, right? And all of the stuff that's happened to Indigenous people, and we talk about lateral violence in our nations, and when you're seriously injured, and again, when I wish I could show you, I could draw that and it would help explain things. But when you look at what the intention was to remove a race, and that was the intention, right? Was like, we want you either gone, no longer existed, or we want you assimilated into how we do things. That did a real hardcore, deep number on us, right? So much so that a lot of our people lost their way. But those teachings are coming back. And I was just reminded, I want to say about a month ago, that our children are on loan to us. And when you think about that concept, wow, that's our responsibility as adults or grandparents, no matter what race we are from. And if we can get that message across to people that, hey, that's a gift to us. When somebody gives you a beautiful gift, you never break it, right? You nurture it, you take care of it. And I think bringing those teachings back are going to really help everybody understand why why we need to get back to that space where we need each other. And again, I think it comes back to land. At the end of the day, like, we have to face it, that greed is a pretty powerful thing in our lives, right? Everybody wants land. We want this, we need this, and the little bits of land that we do have in our nation, like, we have a small community. We have a big one, but they put us onto this reserve. Didn't want nothing to do with us, right? Left us there, and there was violence and there was drinking and there was all kinds of stuff going on for years and years. Well, my little community right now, we have 19 gold mine agreements. Everybody wants us now. Everybody likes us. I'm like, and now we find ourselves sitting here. We're like, oh my God, they want another mine to go up across the road from us where our spring water is. And so we're resisting it because it's our water, and our water is life, right? But yet, when we do get up and say no, then we get the other races, or I don't want to say races, corporations. Forget that they're human too, right? They forget that there's human beings in there. But we get these corporations that go, we don't care about this. We see that. And then I think about supply and demand a lot as well. You know, how do we I always wonder, how do we come together? And part of my questions in my higher learning is, how do I, as an Indigenous woman, learn, grow in these spaces without compromising my values anymore? How do I armor down, right? And I think it almost did reverse with the TRC and all these discussions, in my humble opinion. I think the other races have armored up. and not sure now what to do, right? And it's like, how do we do this without offending or hurting or again, misinformation too when it comes to the media, right? Let's face it, you're gonna have the good and the bad and the ugly in every race. There's a lot of good in all the races, right? And I always say we have to find each other. And once we find each other, we hang on to each other and we grow with each other. And the more you are that way, the more you build, right? So that's how I see it. It's a work in progress, and I know that I only have one time around. And so what do I want to do with it? And I believe it's finding your purpose as well. Like, yeah, like it's coming to terms with the history, really coming to terms with it and saying, okay, oh my God, how do we do this? And I'll give you an example of, I was in I think it was Sachs Harbor, or I was up there teaching, I was training, and I was sitting across from a pilot and his young co-pilot. And they end up staying the night because they end up hitting the lights on the runway. So, and in those Nunavut communities, you stay together, right? You got your little room and you got to share everything. So this pilot was sitting across from me, and he looked like he would be my mom's age. So I asked him, I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Oh, I'm from Amos, Quebec." I was like, "Wow, I know Amos, Quebec." He goes, "You do?" I said, "Yeah, my mom went to residential school there." And he's like, "Oh, that wasn't me. That wasn't me." Like he got like that. And I was like, "Hey, wait a minute. It wasn't me either." I said, "But I'm feeling the impacts of what your forefathers have done, right? It's not about blaming, but it's about saying, okay, oh my God, my forefathers did this." And I reminded him ever so gently, I said, while you were driving by in your school bus, going to your school every day and going home to your comfy home every day and your meals a day. And he would drive by the residential school, actually. He said he saw the school. I said, my mother was being raped and molested. And he was just like, so sometimes that truth, right? Depending on who you're talking to, they need to hear it in a way that there's no, because I find when we talk about TRC, some people get so uncomfortable, they just want to pull back, right? It's too uncomfortable. And I find it's mostly white men that pull back, white rich men that pull back. They're not too sure. They just a little squirmish about it, right? And yet I try and talk to them a lot because they are the ones with the deep pockets, right?
Mm.
And one of my friends said it's not just white men, it's straight white men that we're up against. I'm like, what? Like, it's just kind of crazy how, and with this younger generation too, on how they see the world. I'm like, so we're all flipping and flopping around, and but yet we're still trying to stabilize. And again, I remind everybody, if it wasn't for us, you guys wouldn't be here. So as women, whether we're Indigenous, brown, or Black, we we still are the life givers. So I see us as women that need to make those changes. We need to. We can't rely on the government. We can't rely on these men. Not to say that I like men. I think they're great. I just think when it comes to what we're trying to do in the bigger picture, they're not necessarily yeah, we don't need their energy right now. We need the women energy. That's
Yeah,
my
there's lots of work to do. Yeah.
and I admire you women for doing that work, holding the fort down and staying
Yeah.
the course, right? And I would love to see this organization connect with the Native Women's Association of Canada or the Ontario ones, right? Like, I would love to see that.
Can I just add something about the Native Women's Association of Canada? Jean and I are connected with them. And the declaration that they have on prostitution, they've included torture in it, which is based on our work. So
Yeah.
Faye Blaney's been working with us, which is really exciting. You probably know Faye
Yeah,
Denise.
yeah, yeah. I've just reconnected with the NWAC because I worked for Native Women's of the Northwest Territories for a few years and rebuilt
Yeah.
those guys. So nice to get back into that work.
It's
I
great.
think the National Council would love to consolidate and work together. I know
Yeah.
the Montreal Council, do you know Nakuset in Montreal at all?
No,
No, okay. Native Women's Center there. Anyway, I have just so enjoyed this event. And I was so nervous because my internet has been really crazy today and the spirit is with us, so it worked. And it's just
absolutely.
been such a pleasure to meet with you, Denyse. It's just been, well, heartwarming and also, it just touches you very deeply, not just the positive, but the work we need to do. We need to draw ourselves together and work together. This is not easy stuff. And we
No.
need to keep talking and communicating and listening. And I really appreciate that this wasn't one of those discussions that depended, as I'm quite commonly do, on statistics and numbers. This had to do with storytelling. And you are so right. This is the way to really communicate. So I really appreciate your time. So thank you so much for
Thank you, Penny.
being
Thank
here.
you so much. And this is
Well, I'd
just the
like
beginning.
to echo that a little bit as well. And also, we have worked in the past with the Native Women of Canada. We certainly did with what's her name? Somebody Tutu. When they were trying to get women to have the rights that men had, and they left the reserve and things like that. We did a lot of work on that back, 30, 40 years ago, a long time ago. That time they didn't want to join us formally, because they need their independence, and we respected that. But I think maybe we respected it enough that we didn't always stay in contact. And I think what you're saying is very right, that as women who are trying to make sure that the world is a better place for all of us, that we have a lot of things in common to work together. So, and I must say, your story was one I was so happy to hear. Um, I come from a family which has a lot of church people in it. One of them was the Bishop of the Yukon, who did not like at that time of the gold rush. He was against residential schools. I didn't listen to him, and it's unfortunate because if they had stopped them at that point, and there was that bad enough already at that point because they started in the 19th century, but it's just something that perhaps we didn't get on to early enough to see that. But to try to change people's culture that way, of taking them away from everything else, it never works. And
No.
we know that in Canada so much because we've let people bring their cultures here from many, many countries, and they are very positive Canadians, but they also have their own culture that they still revere, and that's maybe something that we have to continue to think about.
Yeah. Agreed.
In fact, I think
I
our
had
next
just
webinar is going to be on that issue more. Yeah.
I just have one quick question, Denyse. Do you work with other uh, communities in, say, Australia or
With
other
New Zealand, I have
New Zealand? Yeah.
some amazing sisters there that I've met along the way, and we're very similar.
Yeah.
Very similar. They're doing similar work. I think they're a little bit ahead of us in terms of the political side of things. But yeah, I've done a bit of research with their group of women on how we do, especially in the business world as well, right? We're trying to navigate the entrepreneurship world in
Mhm.
both countries. And again, I don't know what it is. For some reason, these places or people don't think we know how to run business. And it's not just Indigenous women, it's all women. I'm like,
Yeah, true.
we we run the nations, we are the matriarchs of our nations. I'm pretty sure we can run a business.
I agree. I agree. Well,
Certainly so much to unpack, and we thank you so much, Denyse, for all of your insights, your perspective, leading on this discussion for us. And this is not going to be our last. I anticipate that we'll have many more discussions later throughout the year with members. So
Great.
on behalf of everyone here today, I'd really like to thank you from the bottom of our hearts, the National Council of Women of Canada, and everyone joining us today. Thank you, Denyse, for sharing your time, your wisdom, and your experiences with us. Your insights have given us so much to reflect on, and your words inspire us to take meaningful steps towards reconciliation and supporting Indigenous women's and families. So thank you for all of you for joining this conversation and listening with your open hearts, and for your commitment to action. Reconciliation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing journey that requires all of us to engage, advocate, and support Indigenous-led initiatives. And let us leave here today with a renewed commitment to honoring our Indigenous voices and fostering resilience and working towards a more future that is with justice, equity, and healing. So thank you once again. Stay tuned for more information and dates for our next webinar in this webinar series in April for the National Council of Women of Canada. And you can find this recording shortly posted in the coming days onto the National Council of Women of Canada YouTube channel. And I will be putting the link in an email to all of our attendees for today. So thank you very much.
Just one other announcement for you as well. We've been working on updating our website and making it more easier to find our policies and things. And we are switching over from the existing website to the new one probably sometime tomorrow. And it will have a different, and we're going to send an email out with the link that's there so you can go to it directly and at that time. And I just ask you if there's things in there that you either don't like or you think are missing or you like changed or any other things. We're always happy to hear about that because we want to make it something that is a very meaningful area where you can actually find out things and the types of things we've been working on and to see what kind of policy we're missing, because we want to make sure we have the policy that we put through our system to make sure it's correct in order to be able to stand up and speak when it's important.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care, and we'll see you ladies again. I'm
Yes,
sure.
definitely.
We just opened the door.
Thank you so much. And we send all of our well wishes to your aunt for her speedy recovery.
Yes,
Absolutely. Thank
definitely.
you very much.
God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God
Take
bless.
care.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.